Thank you for coming out this morning. I'm Brian Aronson, and I'm here to introduce my personal friend, going back probably 30 plus years, Lonnie Nasitir. Lonnie is born and raised in Chicago, Highland Park alum, and he attended college at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has a law degree. Before being involved with the ADL, he worked with the Cook County State's Attorney's Office as a prosecutor, where he rose to the position of a supervisor in that office. In 1998, Lonnie was appointed by the Illinois Department of Public Aid, Division of Child Support and Enforcement, and then the governor of Illinois. Yeah. I don't know what he paid for this.
I honestly always take out the names of the government.
Well, in any event, he was the administrator.
They're all in jail anyway.
However he got there, I'm sure it was on his own merit. In 2005, Lonnie was hired by the Anti-Defamation League. Dr. Dan.
Here's a few.
As a regional director of the Upper Midwest Division, where he oversees a 5-state region. Lonnie's mission at the ADL is to support their objective of fighting anti-Semitism and bigotry in all forms. Through legislation, they partner with law enforcement on issues that arrive, and they also monitor extremist groups. In addition, they make various presentations to schools, both secular and religious, and synagogues in the area. Since taking over as the regional director of the ADL, Lonnie has really enhanced the profile of the ADL in the media. You've probably seen him on TV or quoted in the newspaper, and he's a frequent lecturer on topics of anti-Semitism. So without any further ado, Lonnie Nasitir.
Thanks to everybody for coming out on this kind of cold morning after another snow. This has been not a fun winter, but I do appreciate your time, and it's always great for me to come back up to the burbs where I grew up. I'm actually raising my family in the city right now, so it's a little different to raise kids in the city versus the burbs, but it is a wonderful place, and actually had the fortune of having my parents take my little ones to breakfast today, so it worked out well for everybody. So I'm really happy to be here. I know that this has been kind of a 4 or 5 week symposium to talk about anti-Semitism, and I hope that this lecture will kind of maybe put it all together a little bit, because we're going to talk a little bit about contemporary anti-Semitism, and in particular, Rabbi Stoller wanted me to focus on anti-Semitism now in America, and have a little bit of discussion about anti-Semitism in Europe and other parts of the world. Can everyone hear me? Is that okay? So let's start with the United States. In the early 60s, ADL started a poll of really kind of getting a sense of Americans' attitudes towards Jews. So in 1964, we did our first poll of America, and we asked Americans 11 questions. Okay? The 11 questions are all stereotypes about Jews. Your typical canards about Jewish power, Jewish control, Jewish cabal, similar to what the Protocols of the Elders of Zion really laid out in the late 1800s. And if Americans answered in the affirmative to 5 or more of those questions, we would deem them to hold strong anti-Semitic attitudes. So in 1964, 29% of Americans held strong anti-Semitic attitudes, meaning that they answered in the affirmative to at least 5 or more of those questions. Good news. The good news is that we did a poll just 4 months ago. We do it every other year, and that number has gone down to 12% in America. Significant. I mean, we're only talking about, 50 years, and in 50 years, we were able to see a precipitous drop from 29% to 12%. Now, still, if you take 12%, and there's over 300 million Americans, you're still talking about 30 million Americans infected with this terrible, pernicious notion that Jews are bad people, but nevertheless, a significant drop. Interestingly, we also had broken it down into different demographics, and I wanted to focus on 2 in particular, because I always get the question of, well, what about the Black community? What about the Latino community? So thankfully, we kind of had the foresight in the 60s to realize that minority groups in America will probably continue to increase, and it's important for us to get a sense of how they're thinking vis-a-vis Jews. In the African American community, it has always been double, if not sometimes triple, the American population in terms of having strong anti-Semitic attitudes. The good news is that the last few years, that number has gone down to the 30s to actually 22%. So while it's 10% more than the mainline number, it still is an area of concern, but it is going down. In the Latino community, that's a community I think we all need to really focus a lot of energies towards in terms of them understanding who we are and us understanding who they are. There's no question that in 30 years, if you look at demographic trends, probably 30% of our country will be Latino. That means that probably 30% of our country of Latinos will be walking the halls of Congress and business, etc. Significant change agents in this country. And if they don't understand the importance of Judaism, the connection of Jews to Israel and all the rest, odds are it probably won't bode well for Jews. So I think it's imperative for us to get a sense of who our friends are in the Latino community, begin the process of educating and working together. Now let's find out where they are. Interestingly, if in fact the Latinos are born, and we really break it down, if they're born in America, their level of anti-Semitism is a shade above the American population. So it's between 14 and 15%, that's fine. The interesting thing is if they were born outside of America, in Colombia, in Nicaragua, in Mexico, Spain, etc., those numbers triple. So as of right now, 30% or so of Latinos born outside of this country have strong anti-Semitic attitudes. One can look to probably the church as being the real culprit for this. The notions of Nostra Aetate, the Second Vatican Council, where the Pope took a real stand, as did his elders, in terms of saying that the deicide charge was false, that Jews didn't kill Christ, really kind of took real popularity in this country, and it really hasn't seeped down into Latin America. And if you go to church and you're hearing every day that the Jews killed your Lord and Savior, you're probably not going to walk away feeling really good towards Jews, coupled with the fact that Jewish populations in Latino countries have continued to dwindle. They're still there in pockets, Argentina, obviously, Venezuela, a little bit in Cuba, but Jews are still less than 1% of the population, and as a result, when you don't have experience and all you are really kind of relying on is stereotypes and hearing your priest talk about it, chances are you're probably going to have, unfortunately, a negative attitude towards Jews, and that plays itself out in America. One of the questions that we ask, and this is something I want to just talk about, and we will, by the way, have at least 20 minutes or so after I'm done to just talk and have a discussion. One of the questions we ask is about loyalty. The notion that Jews are more loyal to Israel than the United States. That's one of the questions we've asked since 1964. And while I told you that 12% of Americans hold strong anti-Semitic attitudes, on that particular question, it is always over 30%, always, including the one we did 4 months ago. The notion that Jews will put their allegiances to Israel, sometimes at the disadvantage of the United States, continues to be a third of Americans thinking that is the case. Incredibly relevant for what we're seeing right now with respect to Iran. The notion that the Jews are drumming up the war hawks in D.C., the sanctions bill that's sitting actually right now waiting potentially for a vote. There's been a lot out there saying that the Jews are riding this, it's all about the Jews, they don't want Iran to get the bomb because of Israel, etc., etc. And we, organizations like ADL and others, have been trying for several years to say this is not a Israel-Jewish issue, this is a world issue, and really lay out for the world why having Iran and their proxies having a nuclear bomb is obviously detrimental to the entire world, not just Israel. But that question is something I think is very interesting. How many of you remember a few years ago a book written by Professors Wersheimer and Walt called The Israel Lobby? One person. Okay, so John Mearsheimer is a professor at the University of Chicago, an esteemed professor up until he wrote this book. And Steve Walt at Harvard, they wrote a book called The Israel Lobby. This is about 6 years ago or so. And what they did was, this was during Bush's presidency, they really talked about the fact they felt that it was the Jewish neocons in America that were really bringing the United States into wars we didn't need to fight. And as a result of AIPAC's influence and ADL's influence and all these Jewish organizations' influence, they were really, the Jews, were really running American foreign policy. Okay, one can say we do have disproportionate impact in Washington. I think that's factual. I think if you look at, 1.8 of Americans are Jews, yet, look at this weekend, we have a conference of 14,000 coming. You got the vice president speaking, you got the Speaker of the House speaking. I mean, people respond to AIPAC, and there is something called a Jewish lobby, but there's also a tobacco lobby that's significant, and an automobile lobby that's significant, and all the rest. But what was so nefarious about the two professors, and it wasn't two professors coming from, these obscure colleges. This is University of Chicago and Harvard, two of our most esteemed institutions in this country. Their premise was that not only do Jews have a disproportionate impact on America, but it's at the detriment of the United States. It's the detriment of the United States to further interest Israel's self-interest. That is something that we felt, whoa, you've gone overboard there. You can talk about Jewish control, even though I don't like the word control, but Jewish influence. But when you start to talk about Jews and the notion that we are plotting and have this little cabal to make sure that Jews are going to be okay in Israel and screw the Americans or whatever you want to say, that's dangerous. And we spoke out very, very vocally. In fact, my boss, Tate Foxman, wrote a book, a retort to the Israel lobby, which really kind of talked about why that particular notion is so dangerous. But that's something that we should always look at, the notion that Jews can't be trusted. And if you look at, and I know this group has been talking about the history of anti-Semitism, I'm sure you studied Hitler. You know, Hitler's central premise was you can't trust a Jew. You can't trust them. You will eventually do something that's going to hurt you. And what makes anti-Semitism so different than other isms is the fact this is what made Hitler so popular. Why people kind of took to his ideology was the fact that he made it so it wasn't just a hatred of Jews. You could hate Jews, but if you don't stop them, if you don't affirmatively stop the Jew from doing X, Y, and Z to you, you're in trouble, and therefore you must eliminate them. So anti-Semitism, and Hitler and many others perfected this, was that you can't just sit idly by and say, I don't trust the Jew. You must do something to rid the country, the world, of the Jew, because eventually they will get you. And that is about as bad as can be, but the loyalty issue goes to the heart of the notion of not trusting the Jew. People have asked me, so is there a correlation between the anti-Semitic attitudes and incidents going down? Is there a correlation between that in the United States? And I'd like to think there is. And we've been trying, we've been kind of chronicling incidents of anti-Semitism in this country for a long time. And the numbers continue to kind of go down, which is very encouraging. In fact, last year, just in Chicago, not that we have every single bad anti-Semitic incident, but it's only between 50 and 60 situations a year that are reported to the ADL. I'm sure there are more in Chicago, but where it gets to a level where they say, I need to pick up the ADL for assistance, that's significantly better than what it was probably 30 or 40 years ago. So why? Why do we have why are these numbers dropping? Again, I don't want to be somebody who just says the world is great and there's no issues anymore and ADL doesn't need to exist, but I want to be very clear about what the facts are and what the dangers are. So why do we think there's been this drop from 29% to 12%? I'd like to look at a couple things. Number one is I do believe this country has become much more tolerant. Separate and apart from what happened this week in Arizona, thankfully the governor vetoed that bill, I do like to think that this country has become much more open, inclusive, etc. You don't have to go too far to see obviously what's happened with respect to the black community and others, and now the gay community as well. There's been a lot more tolerance towards people that are quote different than others, which I think is positive. And all you have to look, politics aside, is the fact that a president was elected in the country who was African American in 2008 is remarkable, considering that just 60 years ago that same president would have had to go to a different drinking fountain in certain parts of this country. Amazing. In the annals of history and all the rest, the fact that we've been able to, in 60 years, which is nothing in terms of historical time, been able to then elect a president that's black, that just is, I think, symptomatic and emblematic of where we have come as a country in terms of our beliefs of kind of keeping race, keeping religion aside, and really kind of looking at the content of character, as Martin Luther King has said in many speeches. The other thing I think a lot of people take for granted, at ADL, we focus a lot of our efforts on First Amendment advocacy, and that is the First Amendment. There is something very unique and special about this country, and one of the things that makes it so special is that amendment. The notion that anyone can practice freely their religion without governmental interference, the fact that the government is going to put their imprimatur and say you must be this, you must be that, is amazing. And I got to tell you, that is probably, if not the number one, number two reasons why Jews have flourished in this country is that First Amendment. The notion that we can be Jews, we can wear a kippah and not suffer consequences. The fact that we don't have to be told what to practice. The fact that somebody doesn't have to be told what, if they want to practice nothing, they can do that as well. That is unique in the annals of history, and I do have to think that that has brought about a temperature of inclusivity and obviously very much acceptance in this country because of that tenet, and then because we continue to make sure that it's promoted and it's followed is something that I think we can't take for granted in this country. Now I want to kind of focus a little bit on other parts of the world. But before I do that, I do want to put a quick plug in for the ADL as kind of the last reason why I think there's been a change. And that is that, and those of you old enough to remember, and I can't, the days of Father Coughlin and Henry Ford, and the notion that there were preeminent leaders in this country who espoused anti-Semitism freely without any repercussions or consequences, that has changed. You no longer can be an avowed anti-Semite and have the stage anymore. There will be ramifications and repercussions. You can look no further than a Mel Gibson, whose career has completely tanked since he had that moment of clarity in the back of that squad car when he just finally really kind of let it go in terms of his belief about Jews. Or you look at Helen Thomas, the woman that covered 8 presidents, and the minute she really kind of let her feelings go about Jews and being thrown back out of Israel into Europe, she was persona non grata and didn't have the ability to even cover the White House anymore. So there are repercussions, and I'd like to think that's the ADL and organizations like ours that has stood up and said, no, this is not appropriate. No longer can a Henry Ford, a beacon of industry, no longer can a Father Coughlin who has millions of viewers and listeners not suffer some form of consequence for having a strong anti-Semitic attitude. So I think that is something we need to think about as well. It no longer is okay. In Europe, unfortunately, it is okay. So the same polling that we do in America, we also have been doing in Europe for a long time. We don't do 11 questions in Europe because they don't have the patience, to be honest with you. So we do 4 questions. And it really has to do with Jewish power, control over banking, finance, media, and then the last question we ask has to do with the Holocaust. Do Jews talk too much about the Holocaust? Because we figure, obviously, the fact that the Holocaust happened in Europe, is it on their minds? Are they beginning to get Holocaust fatigue, whatever you want to call it, to the point where it manifests itself into a hatred or a real animosity towards Jews? If they answer in the affirmative to 3 of 4 of those questions, then we would hold those Europeans to having strong anti-Semitic attitudes. And the numbers in Europe are triple, if not sometimes 6 times as much. The average in Europe is over 30% holding strong anti-Semitic attitudes, and in Hungary, Poland, Spain, it's over 60%. So the numbers are just staggering. And unfortunately, if you look at what's happening in Hungary in terms of more of these kind of nationalistic groups coming to power, it's very, very scary. And Jews in France and Jews in England and Jews throughout Europe are not living the way we are. That is just a fact. They're not necessarily walking down the street and getting thrown rocks at or getting beat up every time they're wearing their kippah, but I can tell you that it is different. And we have been working closely with similar organizations in those countries to deal with the issues that they have to deal with, walking to and from synagogue, the fact that they need heavy security at every single Jewish institution, the fact that political parties are free to talk about an anti-Semitic plank in their literature and in their speeches. It is a different environment, and the Israel situation has clearly been a real guise for them to just espouse their anti-Judaism through the lens of anti-Israel. In the Middle East, we have never done polling because, quite frankly, we just feel like we kind of have a sense of what it's going to be like. And unfortunately, I think if you polled, it would be even worse than what we're seeing in Hungary, Poland, or Spain. Meaning that I would have to think that at least 3 out of every 4 respondents would probably hold strong anti-Semitic attitudes. And the real question is it all about the Israel situation and the fact that these are 2-3 generations of living with the notion that Palestinians and Arabs have been fled from their homeland and the narrative that we all know? Has that led to a hatred or animus towards Jews? Was it before even Israel? Was there something having to do with Islam and certain brands of Islam? What is it? I think it's tough to decipher, but the bottom line is the fact that there is a strong Israel clearly aids to those numbers going up. In fact, if you go to ADL.org, which, by the way, you can get everything I'm talking about, from our polls in Europe to our polls in America, you can get the full background on everything that I've been talking about, even with more specificity if you go to ADL.org. But every week on our website, we do another political cartoon from the Middle East. We don't do it for people to laugh and joke. We do it seriously because we want to expose and get a sense of what is out there in the Middle East. And the majority of newspapers in the Middle East are, in fact, governmental owned. There's no such thing as a private. Most countries, there's not just private newspapers that are free to do what they want. It really is kind of run through the government, and the government puts its imprimatur on many of the information that goes out. And we do a political cartoon of the week that is as heinous as you can imagine. It's the usual depictions of Jews with the big noses, eating the blood of the Palestinian children, which goes back to the blood libel. Notions of power, control are everywhere in the Middle East. Pictures of Obama with, Bibi's hand on his shoulder, with the Jewish star, the notion that Jews are controlling America, Jews are controlling the media. All those canards are prevalent every single week in the Middle East. And how can young people in the Middle East not be influenced by, unfortunately, what they see every single day in their papers? So, bad situation, and if you're interested, you can every week just check on the different cartoon that we have. Let's go back to America for a second, because I think it's important for us to get a sense of, so there's 12%, but there probably is a reason for the 12%, and how is it now manifesting itself? Is it the traditional situation where Jews are called a kike, or that they're being picked on, or this, that, and the other? And I think the traditional manifestations of anti-Semitism have in fact changed. It's not to mean that Jewish kids aren't talked to in a certain way in certain parts of this country, we get it all the time, or that there aren't situations where you have classic anti-Semitism, but I'd like to think that the anti-Semitism that exists in this country is much more subtle and much more through the lens of the Israel issue. You don't have to look much further than what's been happening in this country in the last couple of months with this BDS movement. How many of you have heard of BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement? That is a very pro-Palestinian initiative that is really looking to figure out ways to boycott anything having to do with Israel, whether it be Israel academia, Israel arts, Israel business, figuring out ways to get to the levers of control and saying, we're not going to buy products from Israel, to try to send a message that Israel needs to change, whether it be their policies towards Palestinians, the occupation, et cetera, et cetera. And while at the initial stages, we kind of scoffed at it and said, this is not going to really be much of anything, in the last year and a half or so, especially on campus, they are very organized. They have a narrative that is very compelling, not just for Palestinian students, but for non-Jewish students and even Jewish students. We're seeing a lot of Jewish kids really falling prey to their narrative and the notion that Israelis are terrible oppressors. And as a result, take the next step and become a part of the BDS movement to figure out ways to stop Sabra hummus at their school, like DePaul right here in Chicago, or figure out ways to actually impose an academic boycott against anything having to do with Israeli academia. Just 3 months ago, the American Studies Association, which is a small 5,000, 6,000 academic group, decided at their plenary session to impose an academic boycott on Israel. I don't know how many of you heard about that, but we spoke loudly about that, especially when, if you look at the ASA decision, did they go after any other country that is on the UN watch for human rights abuses? Absolutely not. There are countries that are imposing genocide on their citizens. There are countries that won't let women even get into institutions. There are countries that will literally kill openly gay people. There are countries that are openly doing terrible things to Christians. I mean, you name it, unfortunately, it's throughout this world, yet they're silent. And as a result, we need to be vocal, and we need to say, wait a second here. And I look to something that Natan Sharansky developed a few years ago, when really anti-Israel was starting to seep into anti-Semitism. I think that is something our kids need to really focus on too when they're on campus or when they're in high school, is when does something, there is legitimate criticism of Israel, and I'm the first to say, you know what, Israel has its warts. Israel, like any other democratic country, has its issues they need to work on. I think all of us would agree to that. There are some in this country and in Israel that would not agree to that. I think that most people in this room would say, yeah, Israel's got some issues they need to deal with. But the notion that Israel is on par with human rights abusers, and the notion that people are singling out Israel while leaving all these other countries aside, begins to get a sense of, okay, so what's the motivation? So Sharansky came up with what I think is a great test that's really good for our community, students, etc., to think of when you begin to hear anti-Israel rhetoric. And he came up with a 3D test. And Sharansky says, if the rhetoric, if the actions pass the 3D test, then in his mind, and I agree with him, then that goes from anti-Israel, meaning legitimate critique of Israel, into an anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic type of narrative. And the 3Ds are demonization. So when Israel is being demonized, the notion I just talked about, the fact that, Bibi Netanyahu has blood seeping from his mouth, holding Palestinian children, that's a demonization of Israel, right? The delegitimization, and that's exactly what this boycott movement is all about. It's trying to figure out a way to delegitimize what we think is a legitimate entity of Israel. The fact that they're saying there should be no Israel, there should be one country for all people, etc., etc., that's delegitimized the notion of Israel and the notion of Israel as a Jewish state. And the third, and probably the most relevant of the test, is double standard, which is exactly what I've been talking about for the last 5 or 10 minutes. The notion that, and you look at the UN, they're a perfect culprit for this. UN Human Rights Caucus, which probably has anywhere from 60 to 90 resolutions a year. If you look at the percentage of resolutions against one state and one state only, it's over 75% every year, it's Israel. That's a double standard. When you are treating Israel differently than any other country, that is a double standard. So if you pass a 3D test, then you're starting to seep into something that's much more nefarious than legitimate critique of Israel. And that's when we need to stand up and say no. And explain why this is more than just anti-Israel. You're actually getting to the core of probably what your motivation is. That is an animus towards Jews and an animus towards the notion of a Jewish state existing, period. The fact that, I mentioned the fact that the open anti-Jewish sentiment is on the way, and I really believe that it is nowhere near as prevalent as it was 40, 50, 60 years ago. But then I have wake-up moments, and that's when you kind of, it jars you and you say, you know, as much as we like to think we're making progress, there are some times where I look and I say, you know what, maybe we're not making so much progress. And I like to talk about one thing, and those of you in the sports world, and I look at Danny and Brian, because I know them well, and I know both of them really enjoy sports, this has to do with the sports world, but there's an anti-Semitic undertone to this. So, with the internet, obviously, this is a vehicle that can be very promising, very helpful, but there's also a troubling aspect to it too, is that it's an open book for any anti-Semite hater to be out there and express themselves. Most of the time, it's anonymous. Most of the times, if you look at an article in the New York Times, or people start infecting their own anti-Semitism, racism, etc., it's an anonymous tweet, anonymous blog, whatever it may be. And Ryan Braun was suspended last year for steroids, or performance-enhancing drugs, whatever they found in his system. He was suspended for the remainder of the year. And it was a big deal. And this was actually the second time they came out with him. And Ryan Braun, for those of you who don't know, is Jewish. And he's outwardly Jewish and all the rest. So when the news came out that he was suspended and he got caught, the Twitter world went abuzz, and we're obviously monitoring this stuff. There were, honest to God, well over 40 tweets that we saw that were as horrendous as you've ever seen about Jews. Typical Jew bastard, trying to circumvent the system, typical Jew cheater, just like a Jew. It was just over and over and over and over. Now, every one of those tweets I just talked about had a picture of the person. Lonnie Nasitir, typical Jew bastard. Brian Aronson, typical Jew da-da-da-da. They were out there. They weren't anonymous. They felt like it was okay to just express their Jewish venom openly to the world. And those are the times when we all, collectively, my staff, we kind of went through this bit, oh my God, look at what is out there. So while I told you that those respondents who responded, in the affirmative to less than 5, which represents, 98 or 88% of this country, that's encouraging. But how many people, when they're called or asked or all the rest, aren't really talking about their true feelings? And maybe on the phone they want to kind of sound a little bit more PC and all the rest, but deep down they harbor some kind of anti-Semitic instinct, feeling, etc., which is troubling. The last thing I want to talk about, so what do we do? How does ADL figure out a way to continue to bring that 12% number down to something that's maybe even 3, 2, 1? So it's in a variety of forms. Education clearly is the #1 issue in my opinion for us, and 90% of the education programs that we do aren't for Jewish kids. They're for the entire community. We have programs at Stevenson, Highland Park, Deerfield, Evanston, New Trier, where we go in and all the different anti-bias work. We really talk about kids being able to respect one another, to appreciate difference, to not be afraid of difference, to embrace it, and really we hope that kids will actually change the way they perceive one another, especially when it comes to somebody who looks or acts a little bit different. The 10% of the programs that we do for Jewish kids really deals with the issues we just talked about. What do you do when you're confronted with anti-Semitism? Eventually, it's probably going to happen in your life. Maybe you're lucky enough that you go to a high school like Brian and Danny, we went to Highland Park, where I never experienced anything anti-Semitic. I don't know if you two did, but I just didn't. It wasn't until law school and finally somebody said, oh, that guy just chewed me out of money, where I was like, whoa, wow, okay. I was fortunate, but I look across the street, and thankfully we've done programs across the street. We've done programs at Anshiamet and Schechter, and now we're doing stuff at Ida Crown, which we've never done before. But it's those kids, very insular. They are with each other. It's as homogenous can be. My biggest fear is that these kids that are all going to great schools are going to go to a Michigan, Stanford, Irvine, wherever it may be, and for the first time in their life, they're going to be confronted with anti-Semitism or the anti-Israel I just talked about. And my biggest fear is that they don't have the facts, that they'll be intimidated, and that as a result, their Jewish identity and their Jewish affiliation will kind of go to the side during those 4 years and they'll just kind of walk through college as just a regular person without any affiliation towards their Jewishness, which is very scary to me. And then, after reading the Pew study that came out, I'm sure many of you have been talking about it 4 months ago about Jewish identity and all the rest. The numbers aren't great, guys. They're not great, especially in the non-Orthodox world. The rate of intermarriage, the rate of those couples actually raising kids Jewish are abysmal. And when you have experiences like college where you're really kind of shirking your identity, I kind of think it spills over into your adult life, unfortunately, as well. So we want to make sure that these kids are equipped to deal with anti-Semitism and anti-Israel. So we're doing terrific programs which really talk about what do you do when this happens? How do you deal with it? Who do you go to? What does 67 borders mean? What is Hamas? What's Hezbollah? What is, all the different things. What does apartheid Israel charge even mean? What is apartheid? I mean, we take it for granted that we know about it, but if you're 17 years old, you have no clue what happened. You heard about Mandela's passing, maybe they're starting to read about it now, but you don't understand what that means vis-a-vis Israel. So that's what we're doing with Jewish kids. Brian mentioned the fact that law enforcement is a big part of our portfolio, and it really is. And actually, when I was a prosecutor, I had a lot of opportunity to interface with cops, and it was a different interface than what I'm doing right now. When I was a prosecutor, we figured out ways that we would obviously prosecute cases, and it was my first introduction to law enforcement. It was interesting. Now with ADL, the fact that we have so many great resources that law enforcement don't have about extremist groups, extremist activity, and quite frankly, we can put together files on guys that are part of a neo-Nazi group, a skinhead group, an anti-government group that they can't because they have constitutional safeguards, thankfully. They can't just open a file on somebody if they're a part of a group. We can. So the minute something awful happens, whether it be in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, which was that terrible Sikh shooting where we had a file this big on the guy that did this, including information on his girlfriend, which led to her arrest, we're the number one go-to when it comes to non-governmental entities. They want to know what ADL has in the ADL. So we have the goods on these bad guys. Many times we're able to stop things from happening. Just a few years ago, there was a guy in Springfield. He was, Hinton was his name. And he was an American guy that was radicalized by Islam. And we caught a quick blip on one of his blogs, which really gave us cause for concern. We felt like this guy is probably becoming a jihadist, similar to the kids that partook in the Boston bombing last summer. We gave the information to FBI. They immediately felt that we were right in terms of where this kid was leaning, and they put a mole with Fenton for a year and a half. This is the guy who was going to blow up the Springfield Federal Building 4 years ago. He's now in jail for 40 years. But we caught him, and we were able to kind of give them the clue that, hey, this guy is going towards that level. I've got a beautiful letter from Robert Mueller, who's the head of the FBI, to ADL Chicago, saying thank you. Those types of things are great days for somebody like me that has really kind of shifted their professional pursuits to the ADL. The last thing is the stuff that we do with other communities. I mentioned Latino community, Black community, and while the Muslim community is the $64,000 question out there, and everyone asks me, so what are we doing with the Muslim community? I wish I could say we have great programs and we're interfacing and our young kids are meeting their young kids, but we're just not. I wish we were, but unfortunately sometimes politics gets in the way. And there are very few Muslim organizations right now that disavow themselves of the stuff that we find really problematic in terms of rhetoric, in terms of assistance, and it's just the state of things. That's not to say there aren't, good moderate Muslim voices out there. There are, but as organizations go, organization versus organization, it's just not there like it should be. That doesn't mean that we aren't pursuing it and figuring out ways that we can do it. Because I do think it's important. I think there needs to be meeting of the minds. I think we need to kind of understand differences. We need to understand where the other's coming from. It doesn't mean that all Muslims are bad people by any means, and we have a lot of Muslims in our community. But we don't have the same kind of relationships that we have with Latinos, with Blacks, with the gay community, etc. But it's important, and the more we can continue to kind of strengthen relationships with all different minority groups, the stronger we will all be. And it's been great being a part of this organization for the last 8 years because I've been able to see the appreciation that so many groups have for the Jewish community. I can't tell you how many people in the Asian community, Black community, Latino community, gay community will come up to me and say, how are you guys so strong? How are you so collectively so organized that they all want to replicate the Jewish social service advocacy model? Every minority, they all look to us like, wow, what strength. And that's a credit to all of us for caring, for setting up infrastructure, for figuring out ways to take care of each other, and not just Jews, but others as well in need. We're looked at as a beacon of what America should be about, and I think it makes me very proud. And I just hope that I can, Brian and I just talked about it before I went up here, about the next generation. And, I'm at the stage in my life right now where I can sound a little bit older and say, oh, I worry about the 20-somethings. But I do have a little bit of worry. I worry that we've made it too comfortable, and that there isn't an appreciation for what our ancestors have gone through to make our life so good here. And the minute we kind of let our guard down is the minute usually things that we don't like to see happen. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I'm sure some people would like to ask me questions. We can talk about anything related to what I just talked about. We can talk about current events. We can talk about the Arizona earlier. Anything that has to do with stuff involving ADL, I'm here for another 20 minutes or so.
I just want to, first of all,
So thank you, Beth.
thank you.